Have you ever met someone who completely changed the direction of your life? Maybe they gave you hope when you were hopeless. Maybe they spoke one sentence that changed the way that you saw yourself. Or maybe they simply loved you when no one else would. The truth is, every single one of us is influencing someone, whether we realize it or not. And the question isn't whether we have influence. The question is, what are we pointing people toward? So if you're not a Christian or you're curious about Jesus, or even if you are a Christian, I'm really glad that you're here, because today's teaching isn't really about religion. It's about purpose. It's about influence. It's about why some people seem to leave hope wherever they go and others leave confusion. And Jesus has a fascinating answer. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Jesus called ordinary people the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And most importantly, you'll discover that it's not about becoming someone extraordinary. It's about allowing God to transform ordinary people into people who bring hope, truth, and direction to everyone around them. And I want to share why this teaching has become personal for me. So when I first surrendered my life to Jesus, something happened that I still struggle to find words for. Almost immediately, I had this overwhelming desire to tell people what had happened to me. And that really surprised me, because I spent almost 20 years in the occult and the New Age, and I was deeply invested in that. And yet, never once during that time did I feel compelled to sit in front of a camera and tell strangers about what I believed. And after surrendering my life to Christ, everything changed. And the best way I can describe it is that I felt like a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and suddenly I understood things that I'd never understood before. And scripture began making sense, and I started to see my life differently, my past differently, and the world differently. And it wasn't that I suddenly knew everything. It was just that I had encountered someone who was changing me from the inside out. And with that came this urgency to tell people, to tell everyone. And not because I wanted attention or I wanted people to see me. I just, quite honestly, sharing my past is uncomfortable. But, talking about my addictions, my mistakes, that's very vulnerable. And I've just asked myself, why do I feel the need to do this? And why am I sitting in front of a camera? Why am I risk being misunderstood? Why am I exposing myself like this? And the more I've studied this passage, the more I think Jesus has the answer to that, because he says, you are the light of the world. And so he's asking us to not manufacture anything. It's just describing what naturally happens when his light begins to live inside of us. Light shines, and it can't help but shine. And I pray that if someone is watching this and searching for truth, that they won't just see my story, they'll see Jesus. Because if my testimony helps one person take one step toward him, then every vulnerable moment is worth it. So let's look at what Jesus actually meant. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16, it says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So, let's begin with the salt. To us, salt is nothing special. We see it in the stores all the time. It's on our dinner tables. But in Jesus' day, salt was very valuable. Roman soldiers were sometimes even paid with salt because it was so precious. But salt wasn't only valuable because it added food or flavor to food, but it preserved food as well. Without refrigeration, salt prevented meat from rotting, and it slowed the decay. And Jesus intentionally chose this picture because he knew that the world suffers from moral and spiritual decay, where selfishness increases and hatred spreads and families break apart, lies become normal. So God calls his people to slow that decay by living differently. Christians aren't called to withdraw from society. We're called to preserve what is good within it. So that doesn't mean that we're perfect. It means that wherever we go, our workplaces, our homes, our churches and schools, we should leave things healthier than how we found them. People should experience more kindness, more honesty, more forgiveness and patience simply because we've been there. So what happens when salt loses its saltiness? Jesus gives a warning. If the salt loses its saltiness, it is no longer good for anything. So he's not talking about losing salvation. He's talking about losing usefulness. If believers become no different from the world around them, if we gossip like everyone else, if we hold grudges, chase money, compromise truth, just like everyone else, then what exactly are we preserving? We've lost the distinctiveness that points people toward Christ. So Jesus isn't asking us to isolate ourselves from culture. He's asking us not to imitate everything that culture celebrates. And the closer we become to Jesus, the more naturally our lives begin to look different. And not because we're trying to appear better, but it's because his Spirit changes us from the inside out. So, you are the light of the world. Jesus changes the picture again and says, you are the light of the world. And this is so beautiful because elsewhere in the Bible, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. So how can both be true? Because believers don't produce their own light. We reflect his. And just as the moon shines because it reflects the sun, Christians shine because Christ lives within them. So our purpose isn't to draw attention to ourselves. Our purpose is to point people toward him. Light reveals what darkness hides, and it exposes truth, and it gives direction. It helps people who have lost their way find their way home. And the world doesn't need louder voices or opinions. It needs people whose lives reflect the character of Jesus. A city on a hill. So Jesus continues, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Imagine traveling at night and in the distance you see a city glowing on a hillside and you can't ignore it. Its light naturally draws your attention. So Jesus wants his people to live that way, not by seeking fame or chasing popularity or living in a superficial way, but by living such transformed lives that people naturally begin asking, what changed about you? How do you live in peace in such difficult situations? I mean, look at what's going on around the world. It's not easy to live in peace through that. Also, how do you forgive others and find peace with that when others are seeking revenge? What gives you hope? And those questions become opportunities to point people toward Christ. So don't hide the light. Jesus also says people don't light a lamp and put it under a basket. That would defeat the purpose. The lamp is placed on a stand so that everyone benefits from its light. So I think this is something many Christians struggle with. Sometimes we're afraid people will reject us, afraid coworkers will think that we're strange. I mean, for myself, even at work, I started working there before I came to Christ, and then all of a sudden I'm a different person, and I'm talking about different things, and I'm bringing up my faith, yes, but I'm being very cautious about it. Why? Because we don't want to be looked at differently. But over time, Jesus gives us this boldness and this courage to do that. And so that's something that I'm still learning. But just even being here on this channel is a big step for me. We're afraid that family members won't understand. And honestly, I understand that too. There's times when I, felt in the initial moments that my family would have things to say, and they have been very accepting. But there's still those moments where it's like, I'm questioned about some of my decisions. So every time I read these words of Jesus, I'm reminded that he never called us to be secret Christians. He knew that shining our light would sometimes bring opposition. And in fact, this comes immediately after the 8th Beatitude that I just spoke about in my video yesterday. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So Jesus expected that living openly for him would not always be applauded. And sometimes people would be misunderstood, and sometimes they'll reject you, and sometimes they'll mock your faith. And Jesus says that we're still called to shine, and not in an arrogant way, not in an aggressive way, but lovingly and humbly and faithfully. So to that, your first mission field is at home. And a part of this passage is challenging for many people because Jesus says the lamp gives light to everyone in the house. So sometimes it's really easy to appear kind in public than at home. And I've seen this with many people that I personally know that they go to church or they might be good people in public, but then when they go home, they're different people with their family members. And so, yeah, we can be patient with strangers. We can be generous at church and encouraging online, when we're on social media and we're, trying to encourage one another and being nice. But yet we get home and we're so impatient with our spouses, or we're critical toward our children. We're disrespectful to our parents. So Jesus reminds us that no one should miss the light. The people closest to us should experience Christ through us first. Our families should be the first place where kindness, forgiveness, humility, and grace are seen. And none of us do this perfectly, and I know that I don't. And I repent constantly because I know that I can certainly fall into that. But this is the direction that Jesus calls us toward. He says, "Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So notice the goal that Jesus has here. Not that people admire us, not that they praise our ministry, not that they follow our social media. The goal is that they glorify God. And this is something that I continually myself, as I create videos, am called to remember, because the purpose of my channel isn't to build my name. It's to point people to Jesus. And I've said this before in my videos that this is to glorify God. And if someone leaves one of these videos talking more about me than Christ, then I've missed the point. Everything we do should ultimately cause people to say, wow, what an incredible God that she serves, not what an impressive person that she is, because everything in us is the result of God's grace. And so ordinary people can shine. So one of the most encouraging things about Jesus is who he chose. He didn't begin with famous philosophers. He didn't recruit political leaders. He chose ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, working class Galileans, and people the world had overlooked. And yet those ordinary people became the very salt and light that transformed the world. And that should encourage every one of us. You don't need a huge platform. You don't need thousands of followers. You don't need a theology degree. You simply need to faithfully follow Jesus where he has placed you. One conversation, one act of kindness, one apology, one word of encouragement, one faithful decision at a time. So God often changes the world through ordinary people who simply remain available to him. And so ending this with a reflection for everyone, whether you're a lifelong Christian or someone who's simply curious about Jesus, I'd like to leave you with this question. When people encounter your life, do they leave with more hope, more peace, more honesty, more compassion, or do they experience exactly where they experience everywhere else? Because in this world, there's a lot of darkness. So after a conversation with you, are they leaving with a hope, or are they leaving with confusion? Jesus believes that every human life has influence, and we are all affecting someone. And the invitation is to become people whose lives point toward what is true, what is good, and ultimately toward God himself. Because salt slows decay and light guides people home. And when people see God's grace reflected in us, they don't simply notice us, they begin to wonder about the Father who transformed us. So if this teaching encouraged you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. In what area of your life is God calling you to shine your light more boldly? And if you're exploring Christianity and have questions about Jesus, you're always welcome here. And my prayer is that these videos help you discover not religion, but the God who loves you enough to call you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. God bless.